It was Harlem in the early 1930s, and neither of them was famous yet. Louis Armstrong was beginning to be known, beginning to be the kind of name that musicians said to each other with a particular quality of attention. But the world beyond the music world had not yet quite located him. Billie Holiday was 17 or 18 years old, had only recently started singing in the small clubs along 7th Avenue, and was known, if she was known at all beyond the immediate neighborhood, as a girl with a voice that did something unusual to a lyric. Neither of them was yet carrying the weight of what they would become, the names that would eventually mean something enormous to the history of American music were, on this particular night in a club that held perhaps 60 people, simply the names of two musicians who happened to be in the same room. Harlem in the early 1930s was a particular kind of place, a neighborhood that had been producing music at a density and a quality that the rest of America was only beginning to understand. The decade of what would later be called the Harlem Renaissance had seeded the neighborhood with musicians, writers, painters, and performers of exceptional ability, all operating within a few square miles of each other, all absorbing each other's work, all existing in a proximity that produced a particular kind of creative pressure. The clubs along 7th and Lenox Avenue varied enormously in size and quality. From the Cotton Club, where the orchestras were polished and the audience was white and the atmosphere was theatrical, to the smaller neighborhood clubs where the music was closer to the street, where the line between the bandstand and the audience was thin, and where musicians played for each other as much as for whoever had come in that night. Armstrong had come to New York the way he came to most places, with his music already formed, already himself, already carrying the full weight of what he had learned on the streets of New Orleans and on the riverboats and in the Chicago clubs where he had spent the years between. He had arrived in New York in the mid-1920s and had spent the intervening years working in orchestras and small groups, making recordings, building the body of work that musicians were already studying and discussing in terms that suggested they understood something large was happening. What he was building was not a style that borrowed from the tradition. He was the tradition, or was becoming it, in the way that certain figures become, retrospectively, the point from which everything else in a musical form is measured. The night it happened, the night when both of them were in the same room, each aware of the other, neither yet aware of what the other would eventually become, was an ordinary night, in the sense that most nights in the Harlem clubs of this period were ordinary. A band was playing, people had come to listen and dance, and the room had the particular atmosphere of a place where music was being taken seriously by people who understood what serious music meant. Armstrong played first, or played earlier in the evening. Those who were present at various points that night, and who later recalled the evening in the specific way that people recall evenings that they only understood later to have been significant, described his playing in the language that people always used for Armstrong in a small room, that it was different from the records, that the physical presence of the sound changed something about the experience that the recordings, however faithful, couldn't capture, that the trumpet filled the space not loudly, but completely, as though the room had been designed for exactly this purpose, and the music was simply confirming it. That the people in the room, whatever they had been doing when the music started, did something slightly different when Armstrong played. They stopped being a collection of individuals and became, for as long as the music lasted, a single thing. Billie Holiday sang later in the evening. She was not yet a headliner, not yet a name that would bring people in from outside the neighborhood. She sang as young singers sang in those clubs, as part of the evening, one of several acts, performing for whoever was there rather than for an audience that had come specifically for her. But what happened when she sang was what always happened when she sang, even then, before the recordings and before the reputation. The room changed. Not because of volume or spectacle, but because the quality of her voice and the things she did with a lyric produced, in whoever was listening, a feeling of recognition. As though the song she was singing had always been about exactly this, whatever the listener was carrying that they hadn't put into words. And she had known it all along, and was simply saying so. Billie Holiday had arrived at music from a direction that was, by any reasonable account, difficult. Her childhood in Baltimore had been marked by poverty and instability of a kind that would have been, for most people, simply unsurvivable. She had come to New York as an adolescent and had spent the early years of the Depression in circumstances that would have extinguished a less resourceful person. The music had come to her not as a career choice, but as the thing she was, the form in which she could put together a coherent self from materials that the world had done its best to scatter. What she brought to a lyric was not a technique in the conventional sense. Her voice was not large, her range was not exceptional, her formal training was minimal. What she brought was something harder to name, an ability to inhabit a lyric completely, to make a song's emotional content feel not performed, but experienced, as though the singer and the song had become the same thing, and the listener was overhearing something real. She had been singing in the small clubs on 7th Avenue for a year or two, developing the approach that would eventually make her voice the most immediately recognizable in American popular music. Not because of its beauty in the conventional sense, but because of its truth. The flower in her hair had not yet appeared. The gardenia was still a few years away. She was simply a young woman who sang in a way that stopped people, who had begun to attract the attention of musicians who heard in her something they recognized as significant before they could fully explain why. Armstrong's reputation, even in the early 1930s, before he had fully crossed into the broader public consciousness, was of a particular kind among musicians. Those who knew his work, who had heard the Hot 5 recordings, who had seen him perform in the clubs he'd been working since his arrival in New York, described a quality in his playing that they tried to articulate and mostly couldn't. The technical elements were identifiable: the range, the speed, the control, the way his trumpet produced sounds that other trumpet players couldn't quite reproduce. But the quality they were reaching for was something beyond the technical. It was the quality of a musician who had located, inside the formal structures of jazz, something true about human experience, and was transmitting it with a directness that bypassed whatever intermediary usually stood between music and the person listening to it. You didn't need to understand jazz to feel what Armstrong was doing. You needed only to be in the room. What happened between them that night, whether they spoke, what was said, whether either of them acknowledged to the other what they had each heard in the evening, is not something the surviving accounts agree on. Memory is unreliable in proportion to how much time has passed and how large the significance of a moment has grown in retrospect. What the accounts agree on is the general shape, that both of them were in the room, that both of them heard the other, and that something about the encounter was noticed at the time, even if it couldn't be named yet. Billie Holiday spoke about Louis Armstrong throughout her career in terms that musicians who study her work have noted were different from the way she spoke about other influences. She was specific, and the specificity had an emotional quality. Not the respectful acknowledgement of an important figure, but something more personal, more interior, more like the way people speak about an experience that reached them before they had developed the defenses that later experience puts in place. She said in various interviews over the years that what she had learned from Armstrong, or rather, What she had received from him, since learning implies a deliberate transmission, was something about freedom, about the relationship between a musical structure and the emotional truth inside it, about how a great musician doesn't inhabit a song from the outside in, but from the center outward, locating the feeling first and letting the form follow. These were things she had figured out for herself, she made clear, but she had seen it done first. The weight of what both of these people would carry, the records they would make, the miles they would travel, the way their voices would eventually belong to the world in ways they couldn't have imagined on an ordinary night in a small club on 7th Avenue, was not present in that room. It was still ahead of them, still forming, still years away from arriving with its full significance. What was in the room was simpler and more immediate. Two musicians, both of whom were already doing the thing that would eventually make them irreplaceable, in the same room, on the same night, each hearing the other at the moment before the world had decided what to make of either of them. That is the rarest kind of encounter, not the famous meeting that history records and photographs confirm, but the meeting before the fame, when the recognition between two people is purely musical, purely present, uncomplicated by what either of them will eventually mean. The room that held that night in Harlem is gone. The night itself is what remains, in what both of them eventually made, in the music that followed, in every recording that traces back, somehow, to the particular quality of attention that two young musicians brought to the same small room on an ordinary evening in the early 1930s, when the world still didn't know what it had.